Perfect.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. In the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, if you do not thank the people, you do not thank God. So the first thing I want to do is I want to thank Hamza and the Isoc for facilitating this discussion. And I know that students work very, very hard in this period before the exams. You only got a few months to go, so I'm really, really grateful for you guys to actually attend this talk. What I'm going to start off on is, I think, a very important, touching story which a friend of mine told me. Now, he basically a few years ago was in a situation where his mother was dying in his arms. And when his mother was dying in his arms, he realized that he's got all this information in his head because he studied physics, he studied biology, studied a bit of chemistry, and she was dying of cancer and he couldn't actually save her. And this motivated him and this drove him to actually learn how to find cures for cancer. And this very iconic sort of, or not iconic, but this sort of vivid image of his mother passing away in his arms and him being helpless to try and help her, that was something that has actually driven him, and he's now at a point in his life where he's actually an evolutionary biologist, and he's helped many, many people in finding diseases. simple to complex. If this wasn't enough to show that this image is incorrect, this particular common ancestor, which is supposed to have existed 67 million years ago, we don't actually know what this actually looked like. According to some evolutionary biologists, it might actually have been completely bipedal, like human beings. According to others, it was more ape-like. Nonetheless, what we need to understand, that doesn't actually mean that's the way the theory actually works. Now, you may not have understood some of the terminology I've used because some of it requires you to have some understanding of biology, but all I want you to keep in mind is this. We have an image which people think relates to evolutionary biology, yet this image isn't actually the way the theory works. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to be outlining is basically this. Science and certainty. What is the link between science and certainty? Does science lead to truth? And everything that I'm going to be speaking about today, I'm not going to be speaking about from my own sort of wet finger in the air. It's based upon what secular mainstream academics think the way that science actually proceeds. Secondly, what is, firstly, evolution, and what is Darwinian evolution, and what is the current state of Darwinian evolution? I mean, what is its, if you like, epistemic way? What is it based upon? And what I'm going to be highlighting is it's based upon a probabilistic framework which has multiple assumptions, and there's disputes about its most fundamental ideas till today. And I'm also going to be covering God and Darwinian evolution, because this is actually a really, really interesting topic. This is, I would say, something which is not really highlighted that much. I mean, there's not even that much literature on Darwin's own personal sort of beliefs about God and what Darwinian evolution actually has to say about that. Lastly, I'm going to be covering why Darwinian evolution is unique in the history of science, and I think this is very, very important. It goes to show you why there's a sociological understanding or impact, which is a popular level, if you like, which we've all been sort of impacted by, and there's an academic understanding, and there's big discrepancy between the two. There is actually a very large discrepancy between the two. So we want to find out why that's the case, and to find out why that's the case, we need to look at why it's actually unique. And lastly, a little bit about Islam and scientific conclusions. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned before, all of the people I'm going to be referring to today are going to be mainstream secular academics. These are not people who believe in creationism, intelligent design. They are secular mainstream scientists, and I'm going to be referring to peer-reviewed academic journals. Okay, so what is science? Right? Now, this is a very important question. Science is, on a popular level, misunderstood as something completely different to what it actually is. Okay? So, firstly, even this is a very simplistic understanding of what science is. Right? But the way that science is understood on a popular level is science means truth, science means rational, science means logical, science means something beyond doubt. Right? If I want to say on a popular sort of level, or I'm discussing with somebody that they're being irrational, I'll say you're being unscientific, right? You're being unscientific. And that's because of, I would say, the benefits that science has actually given us. So from smartphones to satellites to, apps, our world is actually impacted by science on a enormous level. Because of that, we've started to believe in science as a almost type of alternative view. And this is something which academics, and as we're going to be going through, this is something that academics actually caution us, the laymen, about, the lay people, that science works in a particular way, and it has a particular function, but it's not something that leads to absolute truth. So you have a particular question, you do some background research, you construct a hypothesis, you want to test that, and then you have a particular result. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned before, why do we find science so amazing is because it actually works. So we have a picture of anyone. Can anyone guess who that is?
Is it the inverse square law?
There you go, Apple.
Yeah.
Not Apple, sorry, Newton. So it's Newton, right? So if you look at Newton's equations, right? Now, for those of us who didn't really enjoy physics, this is going to be some bad flashbacks. But look, because of this is Newtonian mechanics. We had all these amazing predictions that we made about the way that the solar system actually worked, where a particular planet's going to be, and we even went to the moon based upon this particular model of the universe. So why human beings love science is because simply it works. Next slide, please. But what we need to keep in mind is just because something works, it doesn't mean that it is true. Now, the first pass, if you like, when you hear something like this, is that doesn't make any sense. I know it didn't make any sense to me either when I first heard this, but this is what actually we need to take into consideration. Say I'm a scientist who wants to find out what color swans are. So I look at a bunch of swans, I say white, 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 and so using this limited set of data, I make a general conclusion: all swans are white. However, one day a black swan comes along and destroys my beautiful theory. So this is known as the black swan problem, or as the philosopher David Hume called it, the problem of induction. Meaning, you can always have a future observation which can contradict your previous theory. So this is the black swan problem. Next slide, please. There's also this particular problem, which is known not as the scattergraph problem. I've only put it as the scattergraph problem to help you conceptualize it. But this is another problem in the philosophy of science known as underdetermination of theory by observation, something like this. Some particular philosophical term that they use. Now, do you have this scattergraph? Now, this scattergraph has some observations. You can see some green dots. Now, based upon these observations, you can make a straight line, you can make a curve, you can make an inverse curve. You guys get the point. Based upon the same observations, you can come up with different theories, different hypotheses. Now, the observations are the same, but using the same observations, you can come up with different theories. This is something which Darwin noted in The Origin of Species. He actually speaks about in the beginning of the book that the same observations that he's used to come up with the conclusions that he's made, somebody else can look at those and come up with something different. And this is simply the scattergraph problem or the underdetermination of theory by observation, whatever. Next slide, please. So there's two main reasons why science changes. Number one, novel observations which don't fit the previous pattern. Secondly, alternative theories based upon the same observations. Now, interestingly enough, Darwin highlighted both of these in The Origin of Species. Right? Now, the thing about a good scientist is a good scientist will always try and give reasons why, if his theory is incorrect, you're going to see X. And interestingly enough, Darwin did actually do that. In chapter 6 of his book is actually dedicated to problems with his own theory. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't believe in the theory. That means that being a good scientist, he knows what to highlight as what was known as a falsification test. Next slide, please. So what doesn't change, obviously, in science is observations, right? Now, we know that if you have, I don't want to go into the technical definition of what gravity is, we're going to go off track there, but we can observe that if you have an object, it will fall towards the ground. We have the shape of the Earth, we have the fact that water is H2O, we have the fact that there are fossils which do actually exist, and DNA is a code. So these are observations which do not change. These are obviously certain. Next slide, please. But science is more than just observations. Okay? Science is where you use observations and you come up with a general theory. So I can look at the stars and I can come up with astrology. Astrology obviously is not science. It's palm reading and it's supernatural. But you can also use the observations of stars and come up with astronomy, which obviously is science. So science is way more than observations. So even though, and this is very, very interesting, Newtonian mechanics worked for over 200 years, at the beginning of the 20th century, Einstein came along and said, guys, I know this worked really, really well for 200 years, but the fundamental assumptions of the Newtonian model are false. Now that obviously shook a lot of people at the time, and there was a lot of controversy, and eventually over time they accepted the Einsteinian model of the universe, which is the general relativity. So let me just show you, and I've only highlighted the most simple things that I hope we can all conceptualize. Time and space was supposed to be fixed from a Newtonian point of view. And remember, the Newtonian point of view, if you made a prediction that where is this planet going to be in 20 years from now, it would have told you. And if you observed it after 20 years, you would have found that's where it actually was. But Einstein came along and said, actually no, time and space are flexible. And I've put a picture in there to try and help you visualize this, although I realize it's not too clear. But time and space is basically like a fabric. It's like cloth. It can move. It's not fixed. Even the definition of mass. Hamza, could you go back a few slides to go back. There we go. You see, can you imagine if you walked into Newton's dormitory or wherever he was working, right, at university or whatever, and you went up to him and you said to him, "Great work, Newton. It's fantastic. All your predictions about where planets actually are working. However, your model of the universe is incorrect, and even the definition of mass that you're actually using to do these great calculations, which happen to give you the correct answer, is actually the wrong definition of mass." You can imagine how upset he'd actually be. But go back to the other slide. That's exactly what Einstein showed. Einstein showed that the definition of mass that Newton was using was actually incorrect, well, not complete. And also that from a Newtonian point of view, gravity is a pulling force, and Einstein came along and said, no, actually it's a pushing force. So he flipped it on its head. So we had this shift from Newtonian to Einsteinian physics. Next slide, please. But look at this. We even went to the moon based upon Newtonian mechanics. Yet the fundamental assumptions for that worldview were shown to be false later on. Likewise, another good example is the phlogiston theory in chemistry. Now, there was this particular theory that you have this substance called phlogiston, which is released when you have objects which actually combust. Using this theory of phlogiston, the element of nitrogen was actually discovered. Now you can imagine somebody has, and I know absolutely nothing about cars, but whatever that blue car is, now you have this blue car, you have nitrogen boosters for that car. Imagine somebody that's using those boosters, and you actually say to them, do you know what, you've got these fantastic nitrogen boosters, but the theory that was used to discover nitrogen, which is obviously very useful, was actually false. That's very hard, it's very counterintuitive, but that is actually what has been discovered. So theories work even when they're wrong, and this is very important to understand. And this is not a wet finger in the air sort of random view that somebody's come up with. This is a consensus amongst philosophers of science that scientific theories in the past have worked even though they later on turned out to be false. Next slide, please. Theories work even when they contradict each other. So we have general relativity and we have quantum mechanics. Both of these theories exist in physics, yet at a fundamental level they actually contradict each other. So they both have predictive power as well. So they both work, but they can't both be true in the literal sense. Next slide, please. So all science changes even if it works. This is the philosopher Larry Loden from the University of Texas. He's written a philosophical paper where he puts together 30 empirically successful theories which turned out to be false. Next slide. Actually, no, go back. Yeah, that's an interesting quotation from Oxford University's book, A Very Short Introduction. Historically, there are many cases of theories that we now believe to be false, but that were empirically quite successful. I put that in there to show you that, look, this is mainstream stuff. This isn't even like really deep philosophy of science. Next. And this is from the book Evidence and Evolution by Cambridge University. The best that scientists can do at any time is to render comparative judgments between theories. Remember the scatter graph problem? So even Darwin realized, look, the best you can do is say that this theory is better than that. claiming absolute truth is not something that a scientist is supposed to do. Next slide, please. Same thing, again, Oxford University's publication, Philosophy of Science. Even the talk of scientific proof is dangerous because it fosters the idea that conclusions are graven in stone. And this is something that obviously philosophers realize the public understands, but at an academic level they know that this is not something that's plausible. Next slide. Change is expected. We should expect change, and this is something that even the Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins highlights in his book A Devil's Chaplain. We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. Interesting words that he chose here, Darwinism. Now, most people, they've heard the word evolution, but they've never heard the word Darwinism, so we're going to define that a bit later on and what does he actually mean by that. Next slide, please. So, if there is somebody who gives you a lecture about Darwinian evolution and they explain to you Darwin's theory of evolution is something which we know is true because of genetics, because of anatomy, because of biochemistry, because of bioinformatics, biogeography, and so forth, you can say, well, yes, of course, we have all these different subfields which are speaking about this particular mechanism, this particular theory, but all of Darwinian evolution is based upon a probabilistic framework which has multiple assumptions, and there's disputes about its most fundamental ideas. So this is something which is agreed upon by evolutionary biologists. This is not something which is, controversial. Next slide, please. So let's go over some differences. So we have evolution, and we have Islam, and we have Darwinism. So what is the difference? Now, one of the things which I'm going to be doing is I'm going through the presentation, but I'm going to try and give more time for the Q&A because that's what we're really going to do most of the learning. So a basic difference between the two is this. Evolution simply means biological change over time. And this was known and written and theorized about for hundreds of years before Darwin. Darwinian evolution is a particular model. It's where we have a single origin and we have all of life sprouting out of this, and you have this branching sort of tree, and all of this change is being driven by this mechanism known as natural selection. Now again, for someone without a background in biology, loaded terms, but the only thing I want you guys to understand at this point is evolution is simply an observation. Darwinian evolution is a theory. Okay? So there's a theory, which is Darwinian evolution, and there is a observation, which is the observation of evolution. Next slide, please. How difficult is it to work out the history of life on Earth? Very difficult. The reason why it's very difficult is because we have actually 99.9% of species missing. We don't have their DNA, 99.999% of species are missing. So we don't have their DNA, we don't have their fossils, we don't have anything, right? What we actually have now is 0.0001%. So to try and reconstruct any history of life is going to be incredibly difficult. So the way that a journal called Science, which is probably the second most prestigious journal in the world after Nature, the way it puts it is this. Imagine if I gave you each a copy of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, right? Only 13 pages are filled with something, the rest of the pages are blank. You have to complete the rest of the story yourself. That's going to be really difficult. The reason why it's going to be really difficult is because you've only got 13 pages. Which characters go in, which characters come in, which characters leave, how does it begin, how does it end? It's very difficult to work it out. That's the way that they described working out the history of life. It's like working out the plot of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace with 13 randomly selected pages. Next slide, please. So remember the scattergraph at the beginning? This is a scattergraph on steroids, right? The reason is because you can look at the history of life and say, well, I can believe in universal common ancestry like Darwin did, or there's a hedge of life like Lamarck, another evolutionary biologist before Darwin did, or the web of life, or gradualism, or rapid change, progression, non-progression. Whatever you make is bound to be open to interpretation, revision, and is bound to be probabilistic. Now you may say, right, I've never heard of the web of life. I've only heard of the tree of life. That's the point. The point is to show you that At public level, we sometimes understand the theory to be, yeah, it's all true, and they've worked it all out, and they've got all this evidence. But at an academic level, there's a lot of discussion going on. So even though you may not understand some of the technical jargon, what you should understand by now is that there's a popular understanding and there's an academic understanding, and the discrepancy between the two is what we're trying to show. Next slide, please. Just So Stories. Rudyard Kipling's book, very famous children's book. So how did the elephant get a long trunk? Well, the crocodile grabbed onto it and tried to drag it into the water, and it got longer and longer and longer. This term, Just So Stories, has been used by some evolutionary biologists to describe the scenarios about the history of life on Earth. And the reason why they did that is because it's really difficult to actually work out what actually happened. It's actually incredibly difficult. How are you going to go back billions of years and actually watch what actually happened? So any of the scenarios that they actually make are very, very difficult. Now, this is Richard Lewontin from Harvard University. He's an evolutionary biologist. And again, these are mainstream secular atheists, academics. And what he basically says is that when you get these scenarios about this thing evolved because of this, how do human beings evolve big brains because they started cooking and so forth, he labels these Just So Stories. Him and alongside him, there's another evolutionary biologist, Stephen Jay Gould. They popularized this term Just So Stories, and of course there was a whole rebuttal to that by other evolutionary biologists. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is to show you that when you're even watching a documentary, you're reading a popular book about how did we, next slide please, how did we evolve a particular trait, just because there's a plausible, coherent story, it doesn't mean it actually happened. There's a difference between what's theoretically possible and what actually happened. And there's a really good example. This is raised by Raymond Tallis, who's an atheist philosopher. And what he does is this. He looks at one particular theory which has been put forth by some evolutionary psychologists about color evolution. So what these psychologists did is that they said, okay, human beings, males and females seem to like different colors. So that's one assumption that they had. So they said, men like the color blue and women like the color red. That's the assumption that they made. And what they basically said is this, right, how do we explain this color preference in the Homo sapiens? And the way that they wanted to explain it was to actually go back to when we used to live in hunter-gatherer societies. And what they basically said is this, you had different gender roles. So you had the men who were the strong brutes who went out to attack mammoths and so forth, and you had the women who stayed behind and did cooking and foraging. So the men who had a gene which had an adaptive advantage, which helped them to hunt, which was the gene to like the color blue. That was adaptive because the sky is blue, so you know it's a good day to actually go out and hunt, and also the watering hole is blue and so forth. The women who were staying back, they were foraging. Foraging, you know what we do at 1 o'clock at night, we go and open up the fridge. In the ancient times, you'd go to the bush. You'd find some berries, you'd find some strawberries, some apples and so forth. So women were interacting with the color red. And the ones who liked the color red were more likely to survive in the same way as the males would do. So Raymond Tallis, what he does is this. He takes this evolutionary scenario and he says, guys, that's great, right? It's a great scenario you have here. You have a great Just So story. But he says, the idea that women like the color red and men like the color blue is actually a very recent phenomenon. Going back to the Victorian times, it's actually the other way around. Men like the color red and women like the color blue. So, and also this is a very Eurocentric view of looking at color preference. So what he does is he just takes this Just So story and he says, look, I don't even need to be a evolutionary biologist to know that this is a Just So story, because clearly color preference during Victorian times was different to today, and this great scenario about what happened 100,000 years ago in hunter-gatherer societies is something which sounds plausible until you start testing it. And that's the whole problem with Just So stories. Now the problem with the Just So story like that is, even if somebody comes along and says, in the Victorian era, men like the color blue, no, men like the color red and women like the color blue, somebody could, an evolutionary psychologist could flip that on his head and say, yeah, that's true during the Victorian era, but 100 years before that, it wasn't the case. You guys get the point. It's unfalsifiable. It's very difficult to disprove. Next slide, please. Homology, homoplasia, quagmire. Right, this is something which is probably going to come up more in the Q&A because this requires a little bit more time. But we get this very simplistic idea, right? And this is because of the sort of public, in public discourse, you get sometimes even public figures who give you a very simplistic idea, which is this. Look at this feature, X, look at this feature, Y. They both look similar, therefore they have a common ancestor. And it's put forth like, oh my God, look, similar, common ancestor. Well, it's not that simple. Firstly, if you say, and we're going to cover this, probably best to cover in the Q&A. If you say, look, there's a similarity here, there's a similarity here, I am assuming this similarity is due to common ancestry. That would be biologically fine, because you're making an assumption and you're stating an assumption, right? But if you say, similarities are due to common descent, look at similarity, therefore common descent is true, that's actually circular reasoning. And this is something which has been pointed out by philosophers. The other thing is, not only is it an assumption, we know of a counterexample to that assumption, which is known as homoplasia. So, we have a wing of a bat and a wing of an eagle, a bird. Both of these wings help this particular organism to fly, yet this is not due to common ancestry, this is due to homoplasia, separate ancestry. Not separate ancestry, sorry, common features which are not due to common ancestry. We have echolocation, you know, where there's this mechanism for blind bats to sort of see what's around them, and also whales. We have echolocation in bats and whales, and we even have genes in the bat and in the whale, which are supposed to be due to common ancestry. No, sorry, which somebody who's untrained biologically may look at and say, hey, this is due to common ancestry. But that's actually, again, homoplasia. And this is a well-known problem which is discussed by philosophers of biology and by philosophers of science and by even theoretical biologists. How do you distinguish between the two? Now, what you can do is this. You can come up with an assumption and say, look, this thing and this thing, we're going to assume these two have a common ancestor, and this is the assumption that we're actually making, and what we're going to do is we're going to use this particular likelihood model and this particular simplistic model or whatever, and come up with a tree. There's actually nothing wrong with that. There's actually nothing wrong with that. Where somebody would be going wrong is where they step beyond the evidence and they say, this is actually true. Because you're missing out a whole bunch of stuff in the background, which is, no, it's not literally true. It's an assumption, and then based upon that assumption, there's inferences made, and that assumption actually has a counterexample. Next slide, please. So, a very interesting way that Isoc, an eminent philosopher of biology, puts it. This is in Evidence and Evolution, Cambridge University publication. Both of the following thoughts are therefore naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they are so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they are so different. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case. Now, let me just put that within context, right? So, Isoc is not some religious lunatic, fanatic, whatever, right? He is an eminent philosopher of science, of biology. He is a atheist. He does believe in human-chimp ancestry, right? He does actually believe in that. All he's doing is, he's giving you the actual framework of how they actually come up with that particular idea, and he's being frank about it. He's saying it is actually based on a probabilistic framework. It is not something which is absolute. And this problem of homology and homoplasia, there's some really striking examples that actually exist, right? So from a linguistic point of view, you would expect the human beings to be the closest to other primates. Yet we find that songbirds are the closest to human beings in terms of language. In terms of sociological structure, you'd expect again chimpanzees, because they're supposed to be our most common recent ancestor. Sorry, we're supposed to have the most common recent ancestor with them. Interestingly enough, chimpanzees maybe live in communities, or maximum they've been observed in nature, about 100, and they do not have the complex sociological structure that human beings have. So here's some of the similarities between human beings and ants, right? Human beings and ants, they both live in massive colonies or cities. They actually have empires, right? They have dynasties. They have large-scale warfare. They have slavery. They have laws. They have funerals. They have trade. They have all this type of complex sociological behavior, which is actually closest to human beings. And nothing else in nature that we've discovered so far is closer to human beings than ants. They even have their own cows, right? The aphids. They've actually domesticated other species as well. So we have similarities at a linguistic level and similarities at a sociological level, which is not supposed to be due to common ancestry. Next slide, please. Now, that's the section on probabilistic framework, right? So, like I mentioned at the beginning, Darwinian evolution, according to mainstream evolutionary biologists and philosophers of science, is based on a probabilistic framework which has multiple assumptions, and there's disputes about its most fundamental ideas. Here are some of the assumptions. Natural selection is the driving force. I already mentioned that previously. Genes are transmitted vertically. We have a gene-centric view, although there's another view which is becoming more popular nowadays. It's all happening gradually. This is extremely important. This is something which Darwin's friend, Thomas Henry Huxley, was known as Darwin's bulldog. He actually asked Darwin, please, can you get rid of this assumption? This assumption is going to be very problematic. And Darwin said, no, I'm not actually going to get rid of it. And in fact, he wrote in The Origin of Species, no gradualism, right? If gradualism breaks down, then my theory breaks down. So what's really interesting about Darwin, and you're going to start to realize this if you actually study this at an academic level, he's very different, very, very different to outspoken sort of atheist evolution biologists today. And they don't even represent academia, because he himself was very cautious with his conclusions, and he also explained what they were based upon. And we don't really get that today. The tree of life, that there's a single origin. Acquired characteristics are not inherited, right? This is known as, well, nowadays it's known as neo-Lamarckism. And mutations are random. Next slide, please. According to the Oxford University biologist Dennis Noble, all the central assumptions of neo-Darwinism have been disproven. Now, word of caution, he could be completely wrong. He could be, in fact, he could, let's just say he's not even a professor, he's just some guy you met at the park and he's sitting on a bench telling you about why all this stuff is wrong. Even if that's the case, the only reason why I put it there is to show that there's actually a valid discussion going on about the very assumptions of Darwinism. His view is actually quite fringe. And remember, Darwin's view was very fringe in the beginning of the war. So these views about not the existence of assumptions, because everybody agrees the assumptions exist, not about the fact that there's it's a probabilistic framework, everyone agrees that that's there, not the fact that disputes exist, we all know that's there. The people taking a particular stance may be fringe, but the reason that why they highlighted here is to show that they obviously understand, and the other side understands, this isn't a case of absolute versus relative. We know that the way that science proceeds is not in an absolute manner. Next slide, please. Right, so we have a whole bunch of alternatives to Darwinian evolution as a mechanism. Now, that doesn't mean the tree of life. We can speak about that in the Q&A, because all of these can be compatible with the tree of life. So we have evolution by natural genetic engineering, put forth by James Shapiro, neo-Lamarckian evolution, which was supposed to have been falsified when Darwin came along, which existed like a couple of decades before him, but that's making a resurgence now. Mutation-driven evolution, Masatashi Nai from Japan, evolution by self-organization, that's Stuart Kaufman, and symbiotic evolution, inheritance of acquired genomes by Lynn Margulis. All of these, and this is very important to understand, other than neo-Lamarckian evolution, because Lamarck's been dead for 200 years, right? all of these that are being pushed today by a fringe group of evolutionary biologists are actually mainstream academics, mainstream secular academics. These aren't like religious lunatics trying to, dislodge mainstream biology. And the reason why they're put there is simply to show there's a discussion going on. Next slide, please. Third Way of Evolution is a project raised by evolutionary biologists who did not feel there was enough academic freedom within academia to actually get their views across. So they made this project called the Third Way. Now the Third Way is people who say, look, we don't believe in intelligent design, creationism, any of that religious stuff, right? We're not into that sort of stuff. Neo-Darwinian evolution, that it's not really been working for us either. So we need a third way. That's why it's called the Third Way of Evolution, a very important project. And you can find a whole bunch of evolutionary biologists from all across the world, North America, North America, Europe, China, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, MIT, all over the world, evolutionary biologists who are on this project called the Third Way. Next slide, please. Now, this is very interesting. I'm just going to mention this briefly because we're going over time. Darwinian evolution, from one perspective, there's a type of proto-Darwinism, right? Now, proto-Darwinism is basically the idea pre-Darwin, which were basically now we know as Darwinian ideas, in terms of the history of life. Now, this is actually linked to the worldview of naturalism. Now, science proceeds by this particular methodology, which is known as methodological naturalism, which is a way that they look at the world, which is that, we look at something, we need to find a natural effect for a natural cause for a natural effect, which is fine. But when you apply that to human beings, then you have to link human beings to other non-human animals. The way that Gareth Nelson, an evolutionary biologist, explains it is, we've got to have some ancestors, as in human beings, we'll pick those. Why? Because we know they have to be there and these are the best candidates. That's by and large the way it's worked, and I'm not exaggerating. The way Richard Lewington mentions it, who we previously saw. And by the way, these guys, they do actually believe in human-chimpanzee history, they do believe in the history of life, but they're just telling you their sort of background knowledge to that. We are forced by our a priori adherence. A priori means before you look at evidence, right? To material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Long story, trimming this quote down, what he's basically saying is this. Materialism or methodological naturalism is the way that we look at the world. The conclusions may be just those stories, may be counterintuitive, may not make sense to us, but that's just the way that we actually do it. Now, if somebody happens to be a philosophical naturalist, which is somebody who believes nature is all that there is, and they are also involved in science, they sometimes can't tell the difference between their own personal worldview, which is philosophical naturalism, and methodological naturalism, which is a valid assumption in science, which leads to much of the discrepancy which we actually see today. Next slide, please. Why is Darwinian evolution unique? Well, it's the only scientific theory in the history of science which morphed from a valid scientific theory, which it still is, but into a religious worldview, into an ethical system, and had a direct impact on politics. Next slide, please. So, some interesting figures here, right? So, we have on the top right there, Richard Dawkins, Oxford biologist, and he says something very interesting in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. He says, Darwin allowed us as in the atheists, to be intellectually satisfied atheists. Now take that particular term and stick something else in there. So imagine a Buddhist saying, Einstein allowed me to be an intellectually fulfilled Buddhist. Wouldn't really make any sense. Well, why does it make sense from an atheistic perspective? Interestingly enough, Darwin would not have agreed with that. Because Darwin said, I see that you can be a theist and you can be an evolutionist, and it's absurd to think that you can't be both. And he himself, actually, Darwin said, in my most wildest sort of fluctuations, I was never an atheist. So clearly, what's being said here is not even something which Darwin actually agreed with. Nonetheless, actually, before I go to him, let me go to this guy. So Julian Huxley, he was an important evolutionary biologist. He was the first president of UNESCO, United Nations Scientific, Cultural and Educational Organization. Militant atheist, right? And he believed Darwinian evolution was an alternative worldview, which he called evolutionary humanism, and he believed it was a secular religion, and that this philosophy had to be taught to people across the world through the education system. Now, obviously, these are not views which obviously Darwin would have endorsed. I don't think Darwin would have endorsed them. If anybody is to look at, the way that he was very cautious with his conclusions. Michael Roos, in a recent book, and again, these are all atheists, right? Michael Roos, in a recent book, Darwinism as Religion, published by Oxford University, what he goes on to say is this. He says, from the very beginning, it wasn't just a scientific theory, it morphed into a secular worldview, which it still is today. And at the same time, Michael Roos says, that doesn't mean it's not a valid scientific theory. It is a valid scientific theory. But he says it's also a secular worldview. Now, none of these people, when they actually speak about this sort of secular, religious view of evolutionary biology, they are not representing the mainstream view in evolutionary biology. They are representing their own views. But what it goes on to show is, one thing is clear, whether you're on the side of accepting Darwinian evolution to be absolutely true, or whether you're on the side of caution. One thing is clear from both camps, it is not just a scientific theory. There is more to it than that. Next slide, please. Darwinian evolution as an ethical system. So, this picture on the right is from Ernst Haeckel, who was a contemporary of Darwin, who wrote a book about human evolution, which Darwin approved of. And Darwin said, if I read this book, I would have written my book. He was referring to The Descent of Man. So you have 12 types of human beings, Homo sapiens. 6 types of Homo sapiens, and you have another 6 types of apes. Now, the highest was for Darwin and for Ernst Haeckel and for the evolutionists at the time, the Caucasian race. And as you went down, you came to number 6, which was the Africans. And the difference between the Africans and the greatest, the nearest actual ape was actually 1 step, and the difference between 6 and 1 was actually 5 steps. Now, we may look at this today and say, that's not what I think evolution is about from a human perspective. Well, that is the way it was actually understood by Darwin and Ernst Haeckel and by the early evolutionists. In fact, this man, Otto Banger, he was a man from Congo. He was captured at the beginning of the 20th century, and he was stuck in a zoo in New York, and he was studied as a ape man, as a link between the Caucasian race and the apes. Now, what this sort of very sort of I would say pseudo-scientific way of looking at human beings, what this goes on to show is that sometimes you can have somebody who has a particular lens on, right? They have a particular lens on that this is the way the world actually works. And that lens starts to influence the way that they interpret the evidence. So what starts to happen is the evidence is no longer objective, the evidence is being filtered through your lenses, and that leads you to make conclusions which, of course, today, we would say this is absurd. In fact, in my readings, and I've looked, you will not be able to find an evolutionary biologist today who will subscribe to this view, except I've managed to find one in America, right? Who does subscribe to this. And I'm sure they are a very small fringe group of evolutionary biologists who may do that, but the vast majority would say this is total nonsense, and they would actually say, no, Darwin was actually wrong here. But this just goes on to show that if you have a particular lens and you're looking at the world, that will influence the way that you actually look at evidence, And this is another problem in the philosophy of science, which is known as theory-ladenness of observation. Next slide, please. Darwinism as a political system, well documented, the way that Stalin actually, when he read The Origin of Species, he said that's what led me to atheism. And when he was applying his sort of communism and doing all the stuff, the great stuff that was happening in the Soviet Union, with millions of people dying, he actually believed it was natural selection. He was actually applying natural selection at a social class level. Next slide, please. So this, I believe, is probably the most important slide, because we began off with, if you remember, this stuff is abstract sort of stuff which a day-to-day evolutionary biologist does not care about. What they do actually care about, for anybody that's been following the news, is that we've been using too many we've been creating superbugs by overusing medicine, and so now we may be looking at a new dark age of human history unless we find basically the new type of penicillin. So that's what evolutionary biologists do on a day-to-day basis. They're not interested in what I just covered. In fact, I remember I met a doctor graduate from King's College who asked me, because I was talking about this stuff, he goes, oh yeah, what's the tree of life? He actually forgot, but it was on a day-to-day basis. It's irrelevant. Anyway, from an Islamic perspective, how would we treat this particular theory? Now, this is where I'm going to use my words carefully, because there could be a lot of misinterpretation. From an Islamic perspective, we can accept Darwinian evolution as a valid scientific paradigm, as a valid scientific theory, valid scientific hypothesis. We don't really have a problem with that. And we shouldn't really have a problem with that. The problem is when somebody says, no, this is not just a valid scientific theory, this is actually true, in the literal sense. That's when we as Muslims would say, well, you've made that claim, but what is that based upon? In fact, we don't even have to be Muslims to do that. We could be even secular philosophers and say, well, you've said it's absolutely true. What's that based upon? It's obviously not absolutely true because it's based on a probabilistic framework, which has assumptions, which has disputes, and it's all predicated on the idea of methodological naturalism. Yes, it may make more sense to you if you happen to be a philosophical naturalist, but from a purely academic point of view, we can't say this is absolutely true. In fact, not even the most popular Darwinist, Richard Dawkins, says it's absolutely true. Right? What we can say is that this is a valid scientific theory, and if a valid scientific theory exists, then we can use it as a working model, and we can work within that field, and we can contribute to that field. And these abstract ideas, which are historical, well, some of them may be true, some of them may not be true. We don't really know, but that's, if you like, a theological discussion if somebody wants to come along and say, no, this is absolutely true. So we can accept it as a working model. Next slide, please. So just to summarize and finish off, I began off with science, what science actually is. Science is not something which leads you to absolute certainty. This is agreed upon by philosophers of science because of the problem of induction, because of the scattergraph problem, because of theory-ladenness. Secondly, the state of Darwinian evolution is based on a probabilistic framework which has multiple assumptions, and there's disputes about its most fundamental ideas. And lastly, this is the point I'd like to end upon, there is a huge difference between the public understanding of the theory and the academic understanding. And for someone to understand why there's a huge difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding, it's not the fault of the academics, it's actually people who promote ideas about the theory which are not in line with the understanding of academia and actually goes beyond the evidence. Which is why, rather than using Darwinian evolution as what it should be used for, which is just a working model that you use to discover new stuff in science, it's actually been used and it's been associated with a battering ram to actually attack religion and belief in God in general. And that is something which even Darwin would not have agreed with. There's a great book, I just recently started reading it, Darwin and God by Nick Spencer, And what he actually does is very unique, because Darwin was a very private person, and his own religious sort of, because he started off as a Christian, and he was a particular type of Christian. He wasn't, what we have today as a Trinitarian. He was a Unitarian Christian, and he went on from Unitarian Christianity to deism, right? Which is the idea that there's a God, but the God created the universe and the natural laws, and the natural laws just, things just ran, and God is indifferent to the way that we actually are. In fact, when he published The Origin of Species, he was still a believer in God. He was still a deist. And we have writings to actually prove that he actually was. And near the end of his life, he became an agnostic. And he started to doubt God. And the reason why he started to doubt God, and this is extremely important, is because of what's known as the problem of evil. His daughter died when she was 10 years old. His son died when he was 2 years old. And Darwin couldn't reconcile how you could have a benevolent, loving God and suffering in the world. Now, what's important is this. Nothing in evolutionary biology led him to the disbelief in God, because he never was an outright atheist. So the fact that he's been associated with New Age, New Atheism is sad, because he wouldn't have actually liked that. Secondly, he didn't actually think that design, from the way it's used from a religious perspective, he didn't think that was completely eradicated. He just believed in a different level of design. So rather than design being each individual species being created by God, he thought maybe you have initial creation which is then changed. In fact, a reviewer of his book actually wrote to him, actually wrote a public review of his book, in which he said about Darwin's book, he said, this conception of a creator, the conception that God created all these different animals individually, or God created an initial which was then evolved, which then evolved into everything else we have today, is just as noble as the other. So he said this one idea of design is just as noble as the other. Darwin was so impressed by those words that he actually included it in his second edition of The Origin of Species. Until today, you will find that quote in The Origin of Species, which clearly goes to show, Darwinian evolution is not, acid to burn away religious belief or belief in God. And that's sadly what is associated with today. So everything good I have said is from God. Every mistake is my own. I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much for listening. Okay, lots of technical jargon. Really sorry about that, but this is because it is a loaded topic. But what I was trying to get across, I hope, was the basic points, right? So this is where I get grilled with questions.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Evolution, whatever, macro, is it macro, micro? In macro evolution, can a claim be made that it's a direct observation?
Okay, the question is macro and micro evolution. Is macro evolution a direct observation? Okay, firstly, micro and macro evolution is not a distinction which biologists like. Some use it, but generally it's something very much disliked. Because you can have macro evolution which is non-Darwinian, right? So, long story short, there's a problem with the question. If somebody wants to ask that particular question, here's the way that you should actually ask it. We have this particular species, and we have this particular species, and we have this thing which is supposed to be a common ancestor or fossil or whatever thing we have. Is that thing a transitional fossil? That would be a better way of actually doing it. Because if I answer your question the way you've said it now, I'd be agreeing to some terms which biologists say we shouldn't actually be using, which is micro and macro.
Alright, so you pointed the question towards the evidence itself, whether it's...
Yeah, because the thing is, whenever you go from the public discourse to the academic level, right? There's some terms that you can't walk in with. There's some terms which are so loaded and muddy that when you try and bring those inside, they get jammed at the door, right? They can't go beyond that. So micro and macro is one of those things, right? the way you should actually ask the question, if you have a particular question about a particular species, is this species related to this species, and is this macroevolution based upon this? Well, the question's already been answered, because it's the assumption of homology, and using the assumption of homology, the inference is made that this is actually a common ancestor. So even if somebody came along and said, we have this particular thing, right? Well, it's still based on a probabilistic framework, and there's still the assumption of homology. So I hope you understand that any fossil or any trait that somebody brings and says, well, this is an evolutionary adaptation, or this has a common ancestor with that, that's all covered within the presentation. Because probabilistic assumptions and disputes isn't over, if you like, it's the system within which everything else in biology actually sits. And there's nothing outside of that.
When you read the book Evolution Deceit by Harun Yahya, or you just see the YouTube videos with all the Christian creationists, you would like to think evolution is a joke.
Yeah, that's I would say that's fodder to the miscommunication that's actually going on, right? So evolution is a valid scientific theory,